Hello and welcome to the Sleuth Booth, and welcome back for those that have been watching the last two parts of this story, which is the Watcher House story. For those that haven't watched it, I would suggest you want to watch part 1 and 2 to understand it better, otherwise you're going to be completely lost on this video. From those who are coming back, welcome back. And just to catch up, obviously we know the Broaduses had purchased a home at 657 Boulevard. They started receiving some weird letters that become quite threatening and quite eerie as time went on. The police can't seem to find the suspect or wherever these letters are coming from. They were suspecting the Langford family because they'd been there so long. You know, it was very easy to match them to some of the information given in the letters, but the Langfords could, no one could, they were just coming up clean. So, there's still this mystery over who's writing the letters. The letters are still coming in, and now, like, the Broaduses are now staying with one of the parents. I think it's the mum's parents, the mum's mother's house, grandma's basically, because they don't want to live in this new house. They paid 1.3 million for this new house. They've had it all renovated, everything. It's a beautiful neighbourhood, but these letters, they've made them too scared, like, for their children now, because these letters have so many reference to the children. So now it's just pretty much trying to work out the puzzle pieces, really, and try and figure out what's going on. So we're going to carry on reading from where we left off, and then see if we can speculate on what we think, who we think the Watcher is, basically. So from a safer distance, the Watcher was a real-life mystery to solve. A commenter on NJ.com suggested ground-penetrating radar to find whatever the Watcher claimed was in the walls. The home inspector had already looked and told Derek the only issue was the ageing home's lack of insulation. A group of Reddit users obsessed over Google Maps Street View, which showed a car parked in front of 657 that one user thought had a man holding a camera in the driver's seat. Others, more rationally, saw pixelated glare. The range of proposed suspects included a jilted mistress, a spurned realtor, a local high schoolers' creative writing project, guerrilla marketing for a horror movie, and mall goths having fun. Some people just thought the Broaduses were wimps for not moving in. I would never let this sicko stop me from moving into a house. Never back down from a terrorist, which irked the Broaduses. None of them have read the letters or had their children threatened by someone they didn't know. Derek said to decide whether this person's only nuts enough to write these letters and not to do something. What if something did happen? So this is the point that I get stuck on, is like, if something did happen to one of your kids and you had the chance to bail out, you'd never forgive yourself. So yeah, like, I think anybody with children would approach it differently, 100%. In Westfield, people were on edge. Laurie Clancy, who teaches piano lessons in her house behind 657 Boulevard, told me one of the students came for her lessons shortly after news of the Watcher broke and started bawling. She was terrified to walk down the boulevard, Clancy said. At the first Westfield Town Council meeting after the letters became public, Mayor Andy Skitsbisky assured the public that the Watcher hadn't been heard from in a year, and that even though the police hadn't solved the case, their investigation had been exhaustive. Which it had, but for good reason, because you really don't know what the end game of these letters are. You don't know what the solid motive is, and psychopaths, psychopaths genuinely, they do drag out their little game or whatever it is they do. That's almost as if that's the part of the buzz for them. You know, sometimes it takes years before you eventually catch whoever, and it always starts off with freaky shit, and then the next thing you know, people's lives are in danger. This was news to 657's neighbours, most of whom had never heard from the cops. We are confounded as to how a thorough investigation can be conducted without talking to all the neighbours with proximity to the home. Several of them wrote in a letter to the local paper. Under the glare of national attention, Baron Chambliss, a veteran detective in the Westfield Police, was asked to look at the case. The Broaduses are victims, and I don't think they got the support they needed, Chambliss, who has since retired, told me recently of the initial investigation. Chambliss knew his colleagues had looked closely at Michael Langford. According to his brother Sandy Langford, Michael has been diagnosed with schizophrenia as a young man. He sometimes spooked newcomers to the neighbourhood when he did strange things, like walk through their backyard or peek into the windows of their homes that were being renovated. But those who knew him told me that the odd things he did were mostly just unusual neighbourly kindness. He goes out and gets the newspapers for me every morning, said John Schmidt, who lives next door. People who had known Michael for decades told me they think he was capable of writing the letters. So, you know, like, I mean, they do say that some of these, you know, criminally minded people, whether it's mental health or mental condition, or whether they're just narcissistical, sociopaths, psychopaths, or whatever, you know, they usually are, one of the ways that they're able to operate and blend in with society is they usually are very charismatic. You know, they usually are very well spoken. You know, they come across gentle, sincere, polite. You know, they do often come across as nice people, and that's kind of part of the hunt, I think, sometimes. You know, they don't come out, you know, with scars and tattoos and their heads all shaved and, you know, you get people like that, but they're not the real problems. Like, these people are intelligent. People that commit these crimes are usually very intelligent. It's almost like a game to them. As Chambers looked into the case, he discovered something surprising. Investigators had eventually conducted a DNA analysis on one of the envelopes and determined that the DNA belonged to a woman. Chambers decided to look more closely to Abby Langford, Michael's sister, who worked as a real estate agent. See, that's interesting. Was she upset about missing a commission right next door? She also worked at the local Lord and Taylor, and Chambers coordinated with a security guard there to nab her plastic water bottle during a shift. But Chambers says the DNA sample was not a match. So it was a woman, but it still isn't one of the Langfords. Not long after, the prosecutor's office gave Derek and Maria some unexpected news. They wouldn't say why or how, but they had ruled out the Langfords as suspects. The Broaduses were stunned. They had recently told the prosecutors that they planned to file civil charges against the Langfords and wondered if prosecutors were lying to prevent the story from blowing up again. My family moved to the Boulevard in 1961 and we never caused a problem for anybody, Sandy Langford told me. This guy gets all these letters and all of a sudden people are pointing fingers. This is true. Yeah, that's exactly what has been happening, but I mean, you can't blame the Broaduses for being suspect at every... I mean, they've been trying to find out who this is for a minute now. This has completely turned their world upside down. So you have to be quite empathetic there. But at the same time, you also have to be empathetic that the Langfords could be completely innocent and all of a sudden people were like on them just because they lived there a long time. It's like, wow, really? So, but the whole situation is just crazy. Left without a suspect, the Broadeses reopened their personal investigation. They were still coy about sharing too much with their neighbours, who remained in the pool of suspects, but spent an afternoon walking the block with a picture of the watcher's handwritten envelope. They hoped someone might recognise the writing from a Christmas card, but the only notable encounter came when an older man who lived behind 657 and his son joked that the watcher sounded a little bit like him. A neighbour across the street was the CEO of Kroll, the security firm, and the Broadeses hired the company to look for handwriting matches, but they found nothing. They also hired Robert Leonard, a renowned forensic linguist, and former member of the band Sha Na Na, who didn't find any noteworthy overlap when he scoured local online forums for similarities to the watcher's writing, although he did think the author might watch Game of Thrones. Jon Snow is one of the watchers on the wall. At one point, Derek persuaded a friend in tech to connect him to a hacker willing to try breaking into Wi-Fi networks in the neighbourhood to look for incriminating documents, but doing so turned out to be both illegal and more difficult than the movies made it seem, so they didn't go through with it. I mean, I understand, like, the fact that you are able to do that, but you can't exactly go to the police and say, look, I've busted this person. Like, the minute that you do that, you've took the law into your own hands, because you probably will find who you're looking for. But there's no way of getting the law dealing. You can get the law to deal with it, but they'll deal with you too for what you did. So it's a messy situation to get in, and it's annoying because it probably will get you the answer you want. Chambliss and the Westfield police were also back at square one. The cops asked Andrea Woods for a DNA sample and interviewed her 21-year-old son, who was surprised to find that he suddenly seemed to be a suspect. A year after the fact, it was hard to find fresh leads, and the initial police canvass had been so porous that it had missed a significant clue. Around the same time that the Broadeses had received their first letter, another family on the Boulevard got a similar note from the watcher. The parents of that family had lived in their house for years and their kids were grown, so they threw the letter away just as the Woodses had. But after the news broke, one of their children posted about it on Facebook, then deleted the post. When investigators spoke to the family, they confirmed that the letter had been similar to the Broadeses, but existence only made the case more confusing. There wasn't a whole lot to go on, Chambliss told me. So, I mean, it just seems like these letters are just flying out and it's just driving people crazy, and there's no end to this. One night, Chambliss and a partner were sitting in the back of a van parked on the Boulevard, watching the house through a pair of binoculars. Around 11 p.m, a car stopped in front of the house long enough for Chambliss to grow suspicious. He says he traced the car to a young woman in a nearby town whose boyfriend lived on the same block as 657. The woman told Chambliss her boyfriend was into some really dark video games, including, in Chambliss's memory, one in which he was playing a specific character, the Watcher. As for the female DNA, Chambliss figured the girlfriend or someone else could have helped. The boyfriend was living elsewhere at the time, but Chambliss says he agreed to come in for an interview on 2 separate occasions. He didn't show up either time. Chambliss didn't have enough evidence to compel him to appear, and with the media attention dying down, he dropped the case and moved on. I mean, that's sad, isn't it? I mean, to think that whether the media are on it or not is what's important here. I mean, that's sad. That's really sad. While the Broadeses continued to be consumed by stress and fear, for the rest of Westfield, the story became a little more than a creepy urban legend, a house to walk by on Halloween if you were brave enough. No one who had lived in the house before the Woodses could recall anything unusual, and it was hard for people to imagine that their idyllic neighbourhood could be host to something so sinister. A woman who lives nearby told me that after the news broke, she and 10 or so of her neighbours had gathered in the street to puzzle out who might have sent the letters. Eventually, she said, they came to a consensus. Maybe the Broaduses had sent the letters to themselves. Well, I mean, it's possible. I suppose it's not rare. The theory, so far as it went, was the Broaduses had suffered buyer's remorse, or realised they couldn't afford the home and concocted an elaborate scheme to get out of the sale. Or Derek was cooking up some kind of insurance fraud. Or they were angling for a movie deal. The Broaduses received several offers but turned them down. Lifetime eventually released a movie called The Watcher, despite a cease and desist letter from the Broaduses arguing that the couple in its movie was biracial, and the letters were signed The Raven. So they'd obviously just took on a story and changed it up. Some locals found it noteworthy that over the course of a decade, the Broaduses had upgraded from a $315,000 house to a $770,000 house, to a $1.3 million one, and refinanced their mortgages. A few weeks after the letters became public, the Westfield Leader published an article in which anonymous neighbours were quoted asking why the Broaduses kept renovating a home they weren't moving into, or questioning whether they had really done that much renovating at all. The Leader even cast doubt on Maria's commitment to her family's safety, citing as evidence the fact that she had a public Facebook page with a photo of her kids. The paper did note that the police had tested Maria's DNA and it didn't match. I mean, it's a possibility, but it's a weird possibility. I mean, come on now. I don't know. I'm stuck. Let me know where you guys are with it. None of the theories made much logical sense. This is where I'm at. The Broaduses had answers to every question. How does someone go from a $300,000 house to a $1.3 million house in 10 years? Derek told me it's America, but they weren't speaking publicly and the rumours persisted. One Boulevard resident wrote a letter to the editor arguing that an elaborate scheme is underway to defraud the Woods family for millions of dollars. Chambliss told me some Westfield cops had even bought into the theory. There were even more skeptics online. I live in a neighbouring town. If these letters have been happening for a while, there's no doubt in my mind that it would have been made public way before this. Lord Fluffer Nutter said on his Reddit. This screams scam. I mean, it could be. It could be. The Broaduses hadn't known how their neighbours would react to the news about the Watcher, but they had lived in the area for the decade, and Maria's family had been part of the community for much longer. So it was shocking to find themselves accused of being con artists. To Derek, it seemed that some in Westfield preferred the conspiracy theory to considering whether their town might be home to a menace. There's a natural tendency to say, I lived here for 35 years, nothing happened to me, Derek said. What happened to my family is an affront to their contention that they're safe, that there's no such thing as mental illness in their community. People don't want to believe this could happen in Westfield. I mean, yeah, you do get that mentality, like, oh, this don't happen around here, or this don't happen around there, and we're all human. No matter what habitat you put us in, same problems follow. While Maria looks back fondly on her childhood, And to add to that, I think people that believe that, by the way, that their area, the way they grew up, was so much better, I think you need to look at how much we can access media now. We've got 24/7, access to news and updates and things like that. We've got much higher populations of people. So not only are you going to have more people, more problems going on, but it's going to be in your face more because of the media. So things haven't changed, they've just been amplified. While Maria looks back fondly on her childhood, she was born a few years after Westfield resident John List famously murdered his wife, mother and 3 children in their home, and remembers a period when she and other kids were warned to look out for a strange van driving around town. My mother always told me don't have a false sense of security, she said. It wasn't that bad things were going on all the time. It was that bad things happen everywhere. She didn't want me to think that this is Maybury. Many locals I spoke to did seem more concerned that the national press might ruin Westfield's good name. Some were primarily worried about arson or vandalism, or whether the Broaduses would maintain the lawn they did. Mark Lagrippo, the neighbourhood's representative on the Westfield Town Council, told me the primary concern he heard from residents was that they were worried about their property value and the stigma of the neighbourhood. I mean, yeah, there's that, but it's worse now. I mean, you've got one group arguing why the Broaduses weren't being more public, and then other neighbours saying that the fact that this is all out there now, this might affect the stigma of where they live and affect their property. The Broaduses were suddenly outcast not only from their home but also their town. Derek wanted to leave Westfield, but Maria insisted on not uprooting her kids. This person took so much from us, Maria told me. I wouldn't let them take more. 2 years after the Watchers' letters arrived, the Broaduses borrowed money from family members to buy a second home in Westfield using an LLC to keep the location private. But staying in town was stressful. The first time Maria let her daughter go to the pool with friends, she stared at the tracker on her daughter's iPhone the whole time. One of their kids was in language art class when the teacher led a debate about whether the family in a book they were reading should move to Westfield. The class thought they should, in part because of how safe it was. Afterward, one of the kids told the Broaduses' child, "My parents told me that no matter what your family says, Westfield is safe." I mean, I'm sorry, but the Broaduses are correct, and so is this kid's parents. Yeah? Like, again, where humans are, human problems will occur. So, yeah, you don't want to convince your kid. Just because there's one crazy person writing letters does not mean your town has turned into a ghetto. It really doesn't. I'm sure most of you will be fine. I promise you. And, so the kid's right, it's a safe place. We like it here. You like it there, you feel safe there. Fantastic. But at the same time, the Broaduses do have a concern. Why do they have a concern? Because no matter what society you are in, shit happens. And the Broaduses are dealing with that shit. So you're both correct. The Broaduses have a reason to feel unsafe, and you have no reason to feel unsafe. There we go. We're on something now. Meanwhile, the Broaduses still had to figure out what to do with 657 Boulevard. Their lawsuit was pending but seemed unlikely to succeed. Some states require sellers to disclose transient social conditions like murders or possible hauntings. In a 1991 case involving an allegedly ghost-filled house, a New York court ruled that, as a matter of law, the house is haunted. Well, fucking hell. But New Jersey had no such regulation. That's crazy. One saying, like, you know, ghosts, they're not real. No, there's no evidence of that. And New York are like, what are you talking about? We've got it in our fucking legalese, mate. Oh, that's crazy. A judge later dismissed the lawsuit. The Woodses, through their attorney, declined to comment for this story. Derek looked into renting the house to the Department of Veterans Affairs and a company that runs halfway homes. In the spring of 2016, they put 657 back on the market, hoping it might garner more interest given how many people had reacted to the letters by saying they would have ignored them and just moved in. The Broaduses had a well-attended open house, after which Derek and Maria spent hours researching every person who signed in and comparing their handwriting to the watchers. But each time a potential buyer expressed interest and met with the Broaduses' lawyer to read the letters, they backed out. Some cocky guy from Staten Island said, "Fuck it, I'm going to get a house at a discount." Derek recalled, he reads the letters and we never hear from him again. So, I mean, it don't matter what the intentions of this watcher is now, because, like, it's affecting people. It's already ruined lives. It's already ruined the house, lives, the street, everything. Feeling as if they were out of options, the Broaduses' real estate lawyer proposed an idea. Sell the house to a developer who could tear it down and split the property into 2 sellable homes. They thought they could get $1 million for the lot. Subdivisions like this had become common in Westfield. Much of the chagrin of many locals, and 657 was one of the neighbourhood's largest lots. Even so, dividing it would require the Westfield Planning Board to grant an exception to 2 smaller lots would be 7.4 and 7.6 feet wide, just shy of the mandated 70 feet. When the proposal was publicly announced, Westfield's Facebook groups lit up. Some expressed sympathy for the Broaduses, while others pointed out real estate is always a gamble. Another faction was convinced this was the culmination of a long con. Out of this whole scam artist story, there ends up being nothing more disturbing than this move. A local woman said a man who coached the Broaduses' son in football wrote they were in over their head from day one. The application was jarring for the neighbours, who had learned about the watcher from a lawsuit and had always found it strange that the Broaduses didn't share more information, not seeming to understand they were following orders from the police and trying to protect their kids. A typical Facebook conversation went like this one. So we're going to look at the Facebook conversations. Sounds like this whole watcher thing was a ploy. The owners are good people, not a ploy. Okay, I know nothing about them. Kristen Kemp, a friend of the Broaduses, had tried to defend some of them on one Facebook forum, but people started attacking her. Somebody asked, "How do we know it's not you writing these letters?" Kemp told me. When the planning board met to decide the application in January 2017, it had already devoted a 3-hour hearing to the issue. More than 100 residents showed up. One of them, who lived across the street and had a daughter in the same grade as one of the Broaduses' kids, had retained a lawyer to fight the proposal. Here was a new suspect. Who but the watcher would go so far as to hire an attorney to preserve the house? After a quick discussion about a Wells Fargo branch that wanted to use brighter light bulbs than the town allowed, the room grew as tense as suburban planning board meetings get. James Force, the Broaduses' attorney, explained that the 3-foot exemption was as narrow as the easel he was using to display a map of the neighbourhood. A map that showed several lots on the block that were also too small. The neighbours expressed concern that the plan might require knocking down trees and that the new homes would have aesthetically unpleasing front-facing garages. Force repeatedly threatened a halfway house as a possible alternative. Guys, let me know what a halfway house is. I mean, I know it said... this is obviously a US thing. The only halfway house I know is a pub. A pub in bordering Essex, East London. But judging by this, I'm guessing is it like a, I don't know, like a charity some sort? Let me know, guys. After the lawyers, a parade of neighbours stood to speak. Glenn Dumont from across the street said the proposal would spell the end of the 600 block of Boulevard as we know it. A woman whose kids had been to the Broaders' old home for a birthday party spoke on behalf of 9 neighbours and presented 657 Boulevard as Westfield's Alamo. Our neighbours are constantly under attack from turf, lights, parking, decks, you name it, she said. If we can't make a stand on Boulevard, where can we? At one point, Abby Langford stood up to say she had spent almost 60 years looking at a magnificent, beautiful house and didn't want to be looking out at a driveway. The hearing lasted 4 hours, during which there was little discussion of the reason the Broaders had been driven to tear down their dream home in the first place. Has anybody thought about whether or not this lunatic who did this has been apprehended? Said Tom Higgins, who lived across the street toward the end of the hearing. Even so, Higgins pointed out that there was no guarantee the Watcher wouldn't send letters to the 2 new houses and argued that aesthetics should rule the day. Putting up 2 houses there is going to stick out like an old client of mine in Texas told me. Higgins said, it's going to stick out like dog's balls. While some of the neighbours expressed compassion, their focus remained on what the Broaders stood to gain financially and what they themselves might lose. I mean, if they're looking to get a mill and they'd already paid 1.3, they're 300 grand down, really, if they do get their mill. But I also do understand, I've seen a property get teared down and turned into 2 smaller properties, and I will tell you now, it looks fucking awful. Awful, awful, awful. I'm not one of those people that, like, oh, what are they putting in their garden? I don't care if you want huge this in your yard. I don't care if you want to have a massive extension. I don't care what people do to their houses. But I have seen a house get knocked down, a beautiful house get knocked down and turned into 2 properties. And yes, I agree, it does look, it looks weird. It looks strange more than anything. At 11:30 p.m, the board unanimously rejected the proposal. A New Jersey judge later denied the Broaders' appeal of the decision. Derek and Maria were distraught. Even if the plan had gone through, it would have only stanched their financial bleeding. On top of the mortgage and renovations, they paid out around 100 grand in Westfield property taxes. The town denied their request for relief and spent at least that amount investigating the Watcher and exploring ways to deal with the home, not to mention cleaning the gutters. The Broaders recognised that 657 Boulevard was a beautiful house on a beautiful street that was worth maintaining, but were surprised their neighbours didn't see the uniqueness of the situation. This is my town, Maria told me recently. I grew up here. I came back. I chose to raise my kids here. You know what we've been through? You had the ability 2.5 years into a nightmare to make it a little better, and you have decided that this house is more important than we are. That's really how I felt. On top of all that, her dad had recently died unexpectedly. Father Michael Saporito, the priest who blessed the house, went to one of the planning board meetings and told me he was taken aback by how many people had come up to him and said that they thought the whole thing was a hoax. I think the human element of the story was kind of lost on the neighbours, Saporito said. The watch had expressed a desire to protect the boulevard from change, but instead it had been torn apart. Not long after the planning board's decision, the Broadeses got some good news. A family with grown children and 2 big dogs had agreed to rent 657 Boulevard. The renter told the Star Ledger he wasn't worried about the watcher, though he had a clause in the lease that let him out in case of another letter. 2 weeks later, Derek went to 657 to deal with squirrels that had taken up residence in the roof. The renter handed him an envelope that had just arrived. Violent winds and bitter cold to the vile and spiteful Derek and his wench of a wife, Maria. This letter, 2.5 years after the watcher appeared, came out of nowhere. So the guy's on it again. It was dated February 13th, the day of the Broadeses gave depositions in their lawsuit against the Woodses. You wonder who the watcher is? Turn around, idiots, the letter read. Maybe you even spoke to me, one of the so-called neighbours who has no idea the watcher could be. Or maybe you do know and are too scared to tell me. Good move. The letter was less stylish and more wrathful than the others, and it seemed the writer had been closely following the story. They had seen the media coverage. I walked by the news trucks when they took over my neighbourhood and mocked me. Derek's surreptitious investigatory efforts I watched as you watched from the dark house in an attempt to find me. Telescopes and binoculars are wonderful inventions. And the attempt to tear down the house. 657 Boulevard survived your attempted assault and stood strong with its army of supporters barricading its gates, the letter read. My soldiers of the Boulevard followed my orders to a T. They carried out their mission and saved the soul of 657 Boulevard with my orders. All hail the watcher. The renter was mentioned. He was spooked but agreed to stay if the Broadeses installed cameras around the house, and the letter it indicated revenge could come in many forms. I mean, it's almost as if this person wants the house just empty. In a way, it's not letting you move in. It's not letting you move anyone else in. Like, they just want it stuck. Maybe a car accident, maybe a fire, maybe something as simple as a mild illness that never seems to go away but makes you feel sick every day after day after day after day. Maybe the mysterious death of a pet. Loved ones suddenly die. Planes and cars and bicycles crash. Bones break. It was like we were back in at the beginning, said Maria, but it also meant fresh evidence that might help invigorate the investigation. Derek took the letter to the police headquarters where a detective looked at a neighbourhood map and traced a circle around the house 300 yards in diameter, suggesting the watcher must be somewhere in there. Derek drew one much closer. In my view, it's one of the 10 houses in the world, he said. The Broadeses continued to press the case, but there still wasn't much for law enforcement to go on, and it was possible to look up and down the street and see the watcher in practically anyone. Residents mentioned to me a teenager whose father had grown up around the corner, and a man who sometimes walked around the neighbourhood playing a flute. An elderly couple behind the house had been there 47 years. The husband was the man Bill Woodward had seen sitting in the lawn chair looking at the Broadeses' house. One of their kids had married a man who grew up in, of all places, 657 Boulevard. But these were bits of information that could mean everything or nothing depending on how hard you looked at them. The Broadeses sent new names to the investigators whenever they found something odd, but their greatest fear was that the watcher could be someone they never suspect. And this is the thing, more than likely. One day last spring, Derek picked me up at Westfield train station. We drove past 657 Boulevard, which he and Maria tried to avoid unless they have to pick up the tax bill. It's all beautiful trees and beautiful houses, but all I feel is anxious, Derek said. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking, what would my life be like if this didn't happen? We lost Christmas a couple of times, and you don't get that back. Christmas with a 5-year-old. No, it's true, man. And that's what makes me think they're definitely innocent in all this. The Broadseers no longer live in ever-present fear, and the Watcher might strike at any moment, but they continue to deal with the lingering effects from the letters. They have a new tenant at 657, but the rent doesn't cover the mortgage. Their kids are occasionally teased at school, and the conspiratorial rumours persist. They try to avoid the people who spoke out against their planning board application or accuse them of being con artists, but suburban life makes that impossible. I see these people on the soccer field, at the train station. My heart starts going like it did when I played hockey and was about to get in a fight, Derek said. When Maria found herself in a spin class at the YMCA with the head of a planning board, she went up afterward and told him, "You continue to hurt my family every day." Early this year, the planning board approved splitting a lot around a corner that required an even larger exception than the Broadseers. Most people in Westfield told me they rarely thought of the Watcher anymore. The real estate market was doing fine, for one, and many were surprised to find out the Broadseers were still dealing with the problem. Hindsight made Derek and Maria wonder if they should have sold the house at a loss early on. This is what I said. And 657 Boulevard conjured too much emotional pain for them to ever consider moving in. They hope that a few years of renting the place without incident will help them sell it. The prosecutor's office was continuing its investigations, but the Broadseers knew it was unlikely the Watcher would ever be caught and that the legal punishment would likely be minimal. The Watcher was also no longer the only person sending anonymous letters in Westfield. Last Christmas Eve, several families received an envelope in their mailboxes. They'd been delivered by hand to the homes of people who had been most vocal in criticising the Broadseers online. One of them, who lived a few blocks down on the Boulevard, had written on Facebook, "I wish we could go back to the days of tar and feathers. I have just the couple in the mind." Another family who got the letter told me it was weirdly poetic, as the Watchers had been, and that it accused the families of speculating inaccurately about the Broadseers. It included several stories about recent acts of domestic terrorism in which signs of brewing mental illness had gone unnoticed. The typed letters were signed "Friends of the Borders family." I mean, the letter writer clearly been infected not only with the Watcher's penchant for anonymous notes, but also the simmering resentment, one that had snapped its way through Westfield, making enemies of neighbours. The people who received the letters didn't know who sent them, but the tone had a familiar ring to it. When I asked Derek Broadus whether he had written them, he paused for a moment, then admitted he had. He wasn't proud of it, and he hadn't even told his wife, and said they were the only anonymous letters he'd written, but he had felt driven to his wits' end, fed up with watching silently as people threw accusations at his family based on practically nothing. You don't go and do what you've been accused of doing if you want to prove your innocence. So I'm just going to put that out there, mate. Derek, you fucked up there. I still believe you in a weird way, but you fucked up there. One of the people who received the letter told me they had never met the Broadseers and had no interest in doing so. The Watcher had been obsessed with 657 Boulevard, and Derek in turn had become obsessed with the Watcher and everything the letters had set in motion. "It's like cancer," he told me. "We think about it every day." Sitting at the Westfield train station, Derek handed me his phone so I could read the fourth letter. "You are despised by the house," it read, "and the Watcher won." And guys, it seems like the Watcher did win, because that is the end of the story. And I haven't looked like where they are with it like right now. I don't know what's happened. It'd be interesting to find out. It should be easy to find out, because again, this started in 2014. This is in reality, these are like recent events. I mean, it started off in 2014, you know, going right up to, you know, just a few years ago, and I'm guessing it could still be going on now. We don't know. So, guys, go check it out. In this episode, obviously, if you check the description, you will see the link to everything that I've read. So if you want to read it yourself, I know it can be quite awkward reading off of a screen and remembering I'm being filmed, and I have a stutter as it is, so I apologise for that. And some things I struggle to pronounce. I'm sorry about that. But if you do want to go and read it yourself, the link will be in the description. And guys, you've been in the Sleuth Booth.